Today, I'm going to tell you a story about a lesson that I recently learned on a flight, which is a sentence that I would prefer to never say again. I learn lessons best on land, ideally with 2 feet on the ground, but I've learned that if a lesson wants to find me, it usually does so with a complete disregard to my preferences. And that was the case last week when I was hurtling across the country on a flight from LA to Boston, middle row, row 11. I think this is a valuable story to share, though, for travel and for life. And since I'm going to have to get on a plane again in a couple of weeks and, continue to do life every day, God willing, I think this is worth sharing so we can learn this lesson together. So for some background, I don't really remember being anxious on planes when I was younger, but in my 20s, it was like something switched. Maybe it's because turbulence has actually gotten worse with climate change, or maybe it's because as I've gotten older, I have more to lose, or I've just had more years on Earth to see bad things happen. But regardless of the roots, the fear is there. To be clear, my flying anxiety is specific to turbulence. It's not about the travel day at large. I like to leave, 2 hours. I like to leave 2 hours before the flight, maybe a little more than two, depending on what time of day it is, or where I'm going, or if it's a really busy time of year. I don't get particularly stressed in crowds. I don't mind waiting in line. When boarding comes, I'm not the type. I'm not the type to really hover around the line. Like if I'm in group D, I won't be blocking the walkway for group A, but I also won't be like sitting multiple rows in the back playing on my phone. All things considered, except for turbulence, I'd say I'm a pretty good traveler. But to get back to the story, last week Brian and I got on the plane from LAX to Boston to spend 3 weeks here on the East Coast, which is where I am right now in my in-laws' guest room. All things considered, things were going pretty well. We got to the airport in one piece very quickly, no traffic, there were no delays. I did have a middle seat, which is not the most ideal, though whenever I travel with Brian, I like to sit together. We're not the kind of couple that does, two aisle seats. I want to sit with him, particularly because of this turbulence anxiety that I mentioned. But on this flight, there were no aisle seats available. So Brian had the window and I had the middle. Now, this situation also typically makes me anxious because I get up to pee quite a lot. Like sometimes in the middle of the night, I'll get up, 3, 4 times, which is a problem that I need to deal with later. Apparently, you got to do some pelvic floor exercises. Did I mention that in another podcast? God, sometimes being on this podcast is weird because I'll forget what I mentioned, and then all of a sudden I'm like, how many times have I mentioned the fact that I have a bladder problem or I need to do pelvic floor exercises? Hopefully, not too many. Anyway, I don't love the situation when there's a stranger in the aisle seat because I worry about upsetting them. If I have to get up on the flight a million times, I just don't want to bother them, right? I don't want them to think I'm annoying. I wish I was the kind of person that didn't care about that, but I don't love confrontations with strangers. I remember once when I was flying without Brian, there wasn't any aisle seats available, and I ended up having to take the window seat, which I know lots of people prefer, but I don't love the window seat. I actually don't even really want to, I don't want to look out the window. I don't like any reminders that I'm on the plane. I prefer to just think I'm on a subway or a train or something like that. And looking out the window makes it hard to forget that you're hurtling through the sky in something that's supposed to be like a bird, but is not, in fact, a bird. And that time when I was traveling, shortly after the seatbelt signs went off, I got up to pee. The man looked at me like he had never been more inconvenienced in his life, and I wanted to say, "Sir, this is the sacrifice you make when you take the aisle seat. When I take the aisle seat, I understand that I will have to get up as many times as the people next to me need to. And that's a price I'm willing to pay so that I have my own flexibility." But he did not seem to understand that unspoken agreement. So I'm in the middle seat, Brian's in the window, and luckily the woman sitting next to me seems to me a nice and flexible person who also happens to be standing up quite a lot during the flight. Now I'll admit that some of her behavior at first kind of freaked me out. Like before the seatbelt signs were taken off, once we had taken off, so we still were not completely, like, the plane was not flat. The plane was still, let's say, at a 35-degree angle going up. And this woman got out of her seat and she walked up to like row 6, whatever's right behind the bathroom that separates the main cabin and first class. And she was kind of hiding like inside the exit row so that the flight attendants didn't see her standing when she wasn't supposed to be. And that sort of freaked me out. I've kind of gotten to the age when I see people blatantly disregarding safety rules, I sort of think that something is wrong with them. Like, I think that they might be dangerous because who, as an adult, would disregard the rules in such a way? Brian would call me a rule follower, which I kind of am a rule follower sometimes, but you know what I'm saying? And again, that's that fear. That's that fear that's come up since I've gotten older. I start to really think that this person could be a danger to me. But I thought about it and I'm like, she's probably not a danger. She happens to have an orthopedic seat cushion So maybe this is actually something about her back. And turns out when she came back, she mentioned to me, hey, by the way, if you have to get up to pee, don't bother. Don't feel bad about asking me because it's actually good. I should stand up more. I'm having some back issues and I need to stand as much as possible. So that immediately relieved lots of my anxiety. It relieved lots of problems for me when she said that. It relieved my anxiety about getting up. It relieved my bladder. Here we go about the bladder again. Enough about the bladder haze. And from there on out, the flight was pretty smooth. And then, about an hour until we land, the pilot gets on the intercom and says, "Flight attendants, take your jump seats," which is just about the worst thing you want to hear when you're a person with turbulence anxiety. It goes quiet for a minute, and then he comes back on and says, "Unfortunately, folks, there's no way around it. We're going to hit some pretty choppy air on the way down, and we won't be able to come through for trash or beverages." He goes off again, goes silent. And then the kicker. If you get motion sickness, we recommend turning your air vents on. In all of my flights, in all of my experiences with turbulence, I have never heard a pilot say that. I have never heard them explicitly give us instructions for motion sickness. So naturally, I begin to panic. I look at Brian and my eyes are like bulging out of my head and he's smiling at me, trying to keep calm. He's wearing his big over-the-head earphones and he's like, "Everything's okay. Everything's okay." And I'm like, did you just hear him? Did you just hear him mention motion sickness? I've heard some weird shit on airplanes, but this one was new for me, and my stomach was just somersaulting at this point, one after the other, down a gigantic hill. Now, I've been on planes before where they tell us that there's going to be some turbulence, and I really value over communication. We talked about this on a previous podcast. If something is going to happen, I appreciate the heads up so that I'm not surprised. So on one hand, when he says this, I'm like, okay, at least I know. Now, I travel with Dramamine on flights, and I also travel with, it's not Xanax, it's like a different type of anxiety medication. The doctor gives me like 6 at a time that I use only for flights, and I don't take it before I get on the plane. I save them for situations like this, when there's going to be a lot of turbulence and I know that I'm going to have this really physical anxiety response. The Dramamine also really, really helps with that. Sometimes I'll just take the Dramamine and nothing else. That's a good hack if you have a physical reaction to anxiety in cars or boats or motion sickness. If you get motion sickness, Dramamine is great, and they have drowsy and non-drowsy. So I look at Brian and I'm like, "Do you think I should take the Dramamine?" He's like, "Great idea, take the Dramamine." And then I remember that I have the Xanax alternative, and I said, "You think I should take some of that?" He says, "Yes." So I take the Dramamine, and then I take half of one of the anxiety meds, and I feel comforted by that. Having that with me does help. A tangent for another time, when I was getting a massage recently, I get into really deep conversations with my masseuses sometimes, and I was in Arizona for my mom's 60th, and me and Vlad, my masseuse Vlad, we were talking about whether it has to do with cyanide and whether people would take cyanide pills if they knew their plane was going down. Let's not get into that. It is a funny story to tell, but not for this podcast. Even though I've taken the meds, I'm pretty fucking nervous at this point. And the reality for me is that the fear of the turbulence happening and the fear of feeling sick during it almost makes me more nervous than the turbulence itself. It's that waiting period, knowing that something bad is going, or not bad, but knowing that something uncomfortable is going to happen and I'm going to have to endure it for 45 minutes, waiting for that to happen, that is what feels the most painful for me. It feels sometimes like experiencing turbulence takes years off my life, but so does waiting for the turbulence to happen, and that is not a great way to live. But to root us back in the story, I've just taken the medication, and we have about 35 more minutes on the flight, and the pilot has told us it's going to be bumpy all the way down. Okay, great. So I'm sitting there waiting for the meds to kick in and waiting for shit to hit the fan. I'm looking at the screen in front of me, watching the map, seeing where the plane's going, and all of a sudden I notice that the time to landing suddenly drops from 28 minutes to 8 minutes in a matter of seconds. Now, one person might think, "Oh, that's great news, we're speeding up." But I'm sitting there thinking, did we just fall out of the sky? I'm pointing at it frantically to Brian, and he's telling me, it's okay, I don't know, it's okay. And I'm like, how did we just cut 20 minutes in half a second? That can't be good, given what we know about the rough air. But then I start wondering, is my medication just that good? I kind of can't feel my legs right now. And is there a possibility that the turbulence is actually happening and I'm just not noticing it? Wouldn't that be kind of cool? And Brian's watching me this whole time. He's kind of smiling me, trying to pat my leg gently. And I appreciate his help, but I also am kind of, shooing him away, because you know how you don't really want someone to touch you when you think you're about to vomit? It's that kind of situation. Turns out that the 8-minute countdown was not incorrect, because moments later, we land. And there was absolutely no turbulence. In fact, if the pilot had not gotten on and said what he said, it would have been one of the smoothest flights I've taken in a while. And instead of being relieved, I was actually kind of angry. That took years off my life, I said to Brian. I started rehearsing what I was going to say to the flight attendants or to the pilot when I walked out. I wanted to, make a stink about how could he have freaked us out for nothing. And like I said, I appreciate the heads up, I really do, but how could he have made a big deal out of nothing like that? I was angry that he got me so worked up, and then nothing happened. Part of me even began to feel scared. Like, if he thought turbulence was going to happen, and then it didn't, does that mean that he doesn't know when bad things are going to happen? Does that mean that our pilots are clueless? And, I had to stop that line of thinking right there. But we're sitting there, I'm talking to Brian, we're pulling up, we're taxiing as they say, and Brian says, "Are you open to hearing a lesson here?" I kind of squinted at him, this evil, kind of devious, silly squint that communicates, I'm kind of in the mood to hear this, but I'm probably not going to take it seriously. I'm probably going to write it off. But permission to proceed. I won't bite your head off. And I'll just to let you all know, sometimes when he says, "Are you open to a lesson?" I say, "No." I say, "Not right now," because sometimes I'm really not, and I know that I won't be able to hear it, and he'll have a better chance of getting through to me later. So he says, "I think there's a lesson here of not getting worked up over things that haven't happened yet." And I'm like, no, Brian, no, Brian. You think that I wanted to have this physical reaction? You think I want to feel nervous? You think I want to feel sick? This isn't something I can control. And he said, "No, I understand that. But you just told me that this took you years off your life. What if you waited for the years to take off your life part? What if you waited until the turbulence was actually happening?" And I waved him off. Yeah. But really, I'm just pissed that the pilot would say that. Shouldn't the pilot have known better? And we got off the plane and we, drove out to Rhode Island. My brother picked us up. But as we were driving, I started thinking more about that lesson. I started thinking about how it sometimes feels impossible to think my way out of fear, but how often do I think my way into fear? I do that all of the time. Sometimes I can excuse that behavior as planning. Sometimes it's really useful to plan for a worst-case scenario, to have scripts prepared, backup plans devised. But other times it's a waste of my time and my precious energy, and this was definitely one of those times. Now, I don't think I'm ready to apply this lesson to turbulence. I don't think that pilots should get on and scare everybody about getting motion sickness and then have nothing happen. I don't want that to continue. But I'm sharing this with you because sometimes the lesson we learn doesn't need to be applied to the situation in which we learned it. At least not yet. In fact, sometimes we have to apply the lesson completely out of context before we can apply it to the one where we learned it in the first place. I don't feel at this current juncture that I can control my physical symptoms to turbulence. Remembering that one time the pilot was incorrect and there were no bumps at all doesn't stop me from remembering all the times when the turbulence was terrible. But even in the last week since it's happened, it has given me perspective when my 2 feet have been on the ground and I've been faced with, all of the challenges that occur in any day. Like when I'm working on something and I suddenly don't think that I'm ever going to be able to do it, or I'm never going to be able to finish, or when somebody hasn't replied to me and I wonder if I did something to upset them. In those moments, I can think, hey, remember that time the pilot said it was going to be a bumpy 45 minutes? And even though you literally thought you had evidence that it was in fact going to be a bumpy 45 minutes, it wasn't. There wasn't a bump at all. You were fine. I can remember that story and think, hey, what could that possibly mean about right now? Could I possibly be overthinking this? Is there a chance that nothing is actually wrong? Is there a chance that I'm okay, that things are going to be okay, that things are going to work out, that we're going to land safely? I'm going to stick the landing. I can say, what if I just wait to see what happens, Hayes? What if I can just assume the best? What if everything will work out? Even if it's in a way I didn't expect, what if it will work out? That's the beauty of, looking for lessons and trying to find meaning out of the mundane things that happen to us. And when we can't find the lesson ourselves, being open to our loved ones and friends sharing them with us. I don't know if I totally believe in epiphanies, but I'll say that whenever I'm moved by other people's stories or advice, it's not necessarily that I can relate to the specific situation that they're describing, but something they say, a specific word or a specific feeling will remind me of something in my life. And in the back of my brain, I'm putting all of these pieces together, and suddenly I feel like I have new insight into something that I'm going through, or a way that I want to be, a way I want to show up in the world. And in the last week, that plain story has helped me in countless other ways. So I thought I would share it with you too. And that's all for this week on Hello Hayes. Thank you so much for listening. I'll talk to you soon.